There's a big red button that says we're live. So unless that is
There's a big
lying,
red button, but I'm actually looking at the social media
might
where
take
we're
a few
supposed to be
seconds.
live, and I don't see the live happening. So
This is the
ah, yeah, we
perils
are
of
live.
this is the
We are
perils of
live.
live TV.
Okay, Habib, so good to have you live on the first EU Insider Live. The EU Insider is back with new logo and also a very new approach to what it's doing, bringing the Brussels bubble closer to the European citizens. And I wanted to kick off with a question that is maybe not an easy one, but let's see what your thoughts are. And that is about if the Brussels bubble is actually doing a good job in bringing the information about what's going on in the European institutions to ordinary citizens.
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. That's quite a tricky question. I would say no, but then again, I don't think we should be too hard on the EU or the EU institutions either, because I think lots of governments all across Europe, all around the world, lots of political institutions do not do a good job of explaining how they work, explaining their processes. I'm from the UK. If I think about the UK political system, I think a lot of people, well, we don't really learn about it much in school. It's only if you select those specific subjects. So I think we've seen in recent years the EU making more of a kind of concerted effort to explain itself, to do kind of marketing for itself, to be a bit more confident in that domain. But I think probably only true change, or at least big change, will come when it's introduced kind of across the board into education curriculums. I don't know if that's possible or maybe even desirable, but that's the kind of thing that could really raise the EU's profile and raise the general awareness and understanding of the EU and how it works. So to answer your question, no, I don't think the EU is doing a great job. It could be doing a better job, but I also think it's doing no worse than anyone else. That's a very diplomatic answer. Sorry.
And in this case, who should be responsible for doing the better job? If not the institutions, maybe it should be the media that are very much present and active in the Brussels bubble, like Politico, Euroactive, Euronews. I have the feeling that they focus mainly on addressing the insider bubble. It's called Brussels bubble for a reason. Maybe they're not doing a good job.
I wouldn't say they're not doing a good job. They're there to serve the market that they choose to serve, right? They're driven kind of by their business strategies as well as their journalistic and editorial strategies. And I would say that the EU media market is somewhat divided. You have the purely EU publications, like some of the ones you mentioned there. You have the international publications, ones that I would class as like the Financial Times, the Economist, who, even though they're British, they're not necessarily serving a British market, they're serving an international market. And then you have the wires, who also have kind of a bit of a different remit and MO. And then you have the national publications where they'll have their correspondents in Brussels. So they all serve slightly different niches, but to the point of the kind of EU media bubble, I think you could almost see them, and I'm speaking maybe to fellow media communicators here, but you almost see them as like a trade publication. They serve quite a niche market who's following quite a niche thing, which is the day-to-day happenings and policy goings on in the EU. Do I think that is innately interesting for people outside of this bubble? No. At least not in that way that it's packaged. It's a very, lots of different people have written previously on LinkedIn and blogs about how it's quite a difficult thing to package and sell to audiences beyond the bubble. So again, I'm not trying to be diplomatic, and I can say some very controversial things if you want, as we get into this
More than
discussion.
welcome.
However, I think, yeah, I wouldn't be too harsh on the EU media in the sense that they're not explaining things well enough to, or they're not kind of carrying these stories over to a national context. But also in defense of the EU market, the EU media market as a whole, I do think we are seeing new entrants to the market in recent years. Publications like Follow the Money, the European Correspondent, who are trying to do that, who are trying to kind of carry these stories beyond the bubble to show people how they affect their lives wherever they may be, whether it's kind of Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, the far reaches of Europe. So I think we are seeing more of that, but it's a tough sell. I'm not sure that business strategy will work. I know from my experience in the UK, and I'm sure you know as well from experience all over Europe, that the people just aren't interested in the EU unless it is a big kind of geopolitical story, let's say. So maybe that's something we can get into, but I do think there has been more interest in Europe in recent years. I would put that maybe down partly to COVID, because people were looking for kind of a centralizing figure of authority. The EU figured quite prominently in the procurement of vaccines. I think events across the Atlantic now with Donald Trump has forced people to maybe think more in kind of regional terms than they were used to doing. So people are now very much thinking along the lines of the US, Europe, China, etc. I think the rise of kind of populist politics as well is maybe making people think along these kind of civilizational regional terms much more than they wanted to. So yeah, I think it's another way of saying that people are becoming more interested in Europe, whether they like it or not. And they'll probably, the residual effects of that will be that they care a bit more about, okay, well, who's calling the shots in that town and what's going on? But are they ever going to care about day-to-day policy updates and reporting on really niche bits of energy policy and environmental policy? I just can't see that happening.
It's interesting because for the last couple of years, I think we see an increase of interest about what's happening in Europe, in the Brussels bubble, and the institutions from national media across Europe. And one of the groups that we should be thankful for in that is the far right that has been using and all sorts of Eurosceptics that has been using the Brussels institutions as the number one enemy, and following what's actually happening in Brussels more relevant. And I consider this as a positive development, because people try to understand more what this entire Brussels thing is about. On the other hand, I recently spoke to a Polish MEP who said, well, yeah, it's all great here, and it's a newcomer to the European Parliament, but I have to be very focused on scheduling my media appearances back in Poland, not to disappear from my voters' radar, because there is no way of communicating important issues while being here in Brussels. And also, I have to engage in the debate about local Polish national issues rather than the Brussels issues to stay relevant, which shows that indeed it's still very difficult to make people interested in the current policy debates, and it's a tricky thing, and I'm just curious if you see that there is a way moving forward with this through either maybe engaging influencers or having more younger, maybe the digitalization and TikTokization of news is a chance to actually get people interested, with MEPs like the young YouTube influencer from Cyprus, Fidias.
Fidias, yeah. I am, apologies, because could maybe still be considered somewhat young, but I'm still skeptical about those sorts of things, purely because the product you're trying to sell isn't that interesting. And like I was saying, there's a lot of people who've written about this before, and the conclusion is essentially that there aren't enough kind of big bang moments in the EU policy-making process, right? Because even when, and this was one of the key things that British media just didn't get, and I think lots of media around Europe don't get about Brussels, right? They'll make grand statements or headlines like the European Commission is banning XYZ. And then when somebody from Brussels looks at it, one of us who kind of live and inhabit this place, we see, oh no, it was just a proposal. That proposal will be torn to shreds, or there'll be lots of things that will be watered down about it. Or they'll say an MEP wants to ban cars, something ridiculous like that. And you look at the speech, and it was just some random parliamentary sitting that has no impact on anything. And it was just maybe an extreme far left MEP saying something about cars. And so I think there's a generalized misunderstanding of across Europe about what the EU does, and that's partly because there aren't necessarily these moments. You could argue that the plenary vote is maybe one where something really happens. It's all very slow and gradual, and that doesn't lend itself to news really that much. So I think that's one of the problems. So essentially what I'm saying is the product is quite a difficult sell to a generalized non-expert market. And this links, I think, in quite interesting ways to what the EU market is and what it entails and who is here, essentially, who is that market that's being sold to. I think it's quite an educated market. I think it is a bubble. It is quite detached in many ways from the world outside. But then maybe to give the media market here a little bit of credit, I think Politico was a bit of a watershed moment in 2015. I think a lot of communicators in the bubble, and I mean kind of general communications people, have been saying that the standards have been slowly rising. I think a lot of people would agree that the standard of journalism, or at least journalism, was brought more in alignment with kind of modern methods of journalism and practices around Europe by Politico. And we've seen this kind of improvement with the new competition there is in the market now. So I think that was already a step in this direction that you're talking about, but even that didn't make people from outside of the bubble care much more than they already do about what's going on here. So it's a complicated thing.
I think it's a general rule good to follow anytime you listen to a politician explaining you something, it's good to fact check if that's really what happened. Well, here we are. None of us is a politician. We're EU bubble insiders. So let's try to maybe talk about something that, in your opinion, Habib, that you believe people should know about what's happening in the Brussels bubble right now, but they have no idea that it's actually important. Is there anything like that right now happening that you would point to?
I mean, just to say as well, on that last point, I think there are lots of vested interests in the EU to basically not have more media coverage or media scrutiny. There are lots of people who do not want to see that sort of thing in Brussels, the TikTokification or whatever gimmick you can come up with of people kind of understanding the day-to-day of what goes on here more. Because more media coverage and perhaps more positive media coverage also brings with it more scrutiny, right? And I think in many ways, Brussels was not set up to be scrutinized by the masses because it was not set up to be understood necessarily by the masses. I keep using the word technocratic. That's what Brussels is. And in some senses, I agree with that sentiment that it can be quite a dangerous thing for people to see what's going on there and to try to kind of dip their finger into every single thing that's happening in Brussels without having the full context. And that's what we saw with some of the British press there. And that's ultimately how we got Brexit, because people were receiving half-truths and just kind of misunderstanding the great system. But sorry, to go to so the question now was...
what's happening in Brussels right now that people
what's happening in Brussels
should know about, and they clearly, for sure, they haven't heard about it.
So I could say lots of things, right? There are loads of things happening in Brussels that people should know about because it will impact their everyday lives. Look at what just happened in the Iberian Peninsula. I'm sure lots of people will be interested in the kind of electricity markets conversation, grid conversation in Brussels. It would bore them to death probably when they opened the first page of that conversation, but it bears knowing, like people, it's a type of thing that people should know about. So I wouldn't necessarily specifically pinpoint one thing. I could also say some of the corruption scandals. People should know about that, right? But again, is it good for people all over Europe to have that one image of the EU? I don't think so. So essentially, it's a bit of a cop-out. I'm saying there are many things that people should know, but I would say actually the one big thing that people should know if they don't pay much attention to Brussels is that Brussels, like we said at the beginning, is starting to matter more. And because of what's going on across the Atlantic, because of what's going on in the Far East, because of what's going on in the eastern borders of Europe, Europe does kind of need to care a bit more about this centralizing figure that is the EU. So people should be aware of that, and maybe that will lead them to care a bit more about who's calling the shots here at the Commission, who's elected into the Parliament, and the sorts of policies and priorities that are being pursued.
In terms of the change of the media scene, because at the beginning we mentioned the biggest brands that report and follow the policy debate in Brussels, but there are much more. There are national, regional. There are English speaking news outlets coming up. There are media startups like the EU Insider, trying to bring the debate closer to the citizens. Is that because you are working with a variety of stakeholders within the Brussels bubble? Stakeholder is basically someone or an organization that is important to those who don't know this serious sounding word. You work with them. You work with Brussels bubble stakeholders as BUMP, helping them to reach their audiences through media campaigns. Is this a considerable change for insiders of the Brussels bubble, that there are new media players like that, or is everyone still focused on playing with the good old big names? You're active, political, and maybe Euronews right now. How does that look? Do you work with Brussels Signal? Would you work with the EU Insider as an important player? How does this look from your point of view?
Yeah, one of the things we often say as communicators at Bump is that you should go where your audience are. So I think it's important to try to meet people where they are. And if they all happen to be reading one publication or another, then you should be there. Unless you have some type of values, motive, or really strong reason why you don't want to go to that publication, if we're talking purely media outlets, then I think that makes sense. So I can't speak for all communicators in the Brussels bubble, but I think probably there's a bit of kind of waiting to see happening at the moment now, and people are probably exploring media outlets that maybe were a bit of an afterthought for them before, because like you said, or you alluded to, we're seeing lots more money being pumped into certain publications. We're seeing new upstarts. We're seeing perhaps previously dominant publications crumble a little bit. Crumble is a bit of a strong word, but just kind of go through restructuring or just doing things differently or not seeming as dominant as they once were. I think probably as well, people are also waiting to see what the lay of the land is in terms of, are some of the new entrants into the market or the new funding that's come into the market, is that purely commercially driven? Are people seeking to kind of get in on the pay-to-play game, get in on the event game, or are some of the new entrants into the market really looking to scrutinize EU media in a totally different way? Because I think one thing you could accuse the EU-specific media of is being that sort of kind of general reporter of what happens in Brussels, because there's so much going on. I really do feel for news teams in Brussels. There's so much going on. They're just purely trying to cover everything. There's not always the time, I think, to go into kind of more in-depth investigative pieces and feature writing and things like that. So maybe some of these outlets are trying to come into the market and do a bit more of that. Maybe they see that there are some openings. So in terms of how I'm approaching it, I'm kind of keeping my ears to the ground, having lots of different coffees with different people, seeing what different news teams are doing, the way they're planning to approach things, and not ruling anyone out. I don't think you should be ruling anyone out in this sense, well, at the moment, just because there are rumors here and there that things are perhaps going badly, or this owner thinks this and that. I think that's not very pragmatic or strategically smart.
So focus on the audience. I think that's a very good approach. Habib, do you see that disinformation is an important topic or challenge for folks in the Brussels bubble?
In the Brussels, so again, this kind of links back to who's in the Brussels bubble, right? I think you had Aaron McLaughlin on the podcast, and he said something that I wrote about a couple of years ago on LinkedIn, which is that the bubble is not very diverse. A lot of people here are from kind of upper middle class backgrounds, very well educated. They come from kind of similar fields, which kind of makes sense. I'm not criticizing it, but I think a lot of people here study policy type subjects, EU politics, those sorts of things, which in and of itself is not a problem, but it's just something that we should recognize, right? I think that is somewhat reflected in the journalists we see here as well, because quite often they studied those subjects themselves, or this is where they kind of made their name in this policy making sphere in Brussels. So it depends how you want to look at it, right? I could quote research from Pew Research, for example, that says people who are more educated change their views much less often than people who are less educated. In other words, they're more ideologically rigid, right? That could be viewed as a good thing or problematic. You could view someone as consistent, or you could view them as just too stubborn to ever change their views, and they're locked in, and you can go into a whole debate about woke politics and anti-woke politics and things like that. So in terms of disinformation in the bubble, you would think that people in this bubble are more immune to that because they have better critical thinking skills to get past that. And I would say, generally speaking, that's probably true, right? But then probably there are also some slightly more insidious ways in which disinformation is spread, or at least allowed to emerge in the framing of articles, because journalists are human, like the rest of us. We all have our own different biases and ways we were raised and environments we were raised in that show us or allow us to perceive things in certain frames, right? And it's very difficult, I think, for individuals to question that and go beyond that if they just don't have the perspective or experience to do that. And so when you factor in that everyone here is from quite a narrow field of perspective, let's say, that's quite a harsh framing, but that's how it could potentially happen in the bubble, because I think you probably wanted to talk about as well how disinformation spreads elsewhere in Europe. So just to kind of give a comparison, to almost say that I think what we have in the bubble is much better than what I'm about to say. But in the UK, you have the likes of the Daily Mail is the obvious one, but I would say like the Telegraph, for example. In Germany, you have the Yellow Press. I think those types of publications are quite willing to pick up populist narratives. And to be honest, I don't want to throw too much shade on populist narratives, because I think they serve somewhat of a purpose. So I'll say they'll pick up disinformation and be happy to kind of run with it, right? And I don't think you could accuse any EU media outlet of doing that or making that their kind of identity. At least not yet. There's some that have shown a potential willingness to go in that direction to try and drive engagement. So yeah, I think disinformation in the EU bubble is maybe a lot more subtle and insidious in the ways that it could spread through the media.
Maybe, going back to why people are not engaged in the Brussels and the future of Europe debate is because it's so technocratic and boring. And maybe what the populists are showing us, and it could serve as an inspiration, that it's actually engaging, interesting, and fun to criticize what Europe is, and we all are allowed. It's not the Europe of the technocrats. It's our Europe. It's the Europe of the people from Spain who want to come to Brussels and influence. One thing I see as a very positive development is that I see young influencers or people actually becoming influencers by doing, or activists becoming influencers on TikTok or even LinkedIn by criticizing the EU, by offering their perspective. And of course, maybe some of their views are a bit immature or show that they don't deeply understand every aspect. Like you said, it's very multi-layered and so on. But it shows that there is actually potential to make this debate about the future of Europe interesting. Because that's the only way to keep Europe going and to keep to building up. We are talking now about military spending on making Europe stronger and more resilient. But what about the soft power? What about people actually feeling that this is a community and a system of common values? That can only be done if everyone wants to debate and offer their criticism, and this criticism should be as natural and as welcomed as possible.
Yeah, I would say I'm hugely empathetic to people who perhaps aren't as educated or knowledgeable, taking an interest in politics and taking an interest essentially in the things that govern their lives policy making in this sense in Europe, even if they know not much about it. I do think they're sometimes in a place like Brussels and the Brussels bubble, we could be accused of snobbishness or like Aaron spoke about on the podcast, just a detachment, a generalized detachment from the rest of the world. But then, like I said earlier, there are complications that come with when you try to introduce certain voices into the EU bubble, or kind of criticisms, partly because, like you said, they don't capture the whole nuance of everything. And I think, not to kind of keep saying the same thing, but I do think there are a lot of vested interests in keeping those conversations outside of Brussels, because Brussels was built to be slow. It was built to be boring. There are a lot of people who tell me we don't need to make Brussels cool again, or cool in general. We just need to make it understandable again. And it's fine to be boring. It's fine to get this stuff done in a boring way. So while I do empathize with that, and I do think, to say something mildly controversial, I'm fully happy for more populist narratives, or kind of tinges of more populist narratives, to be appearing in the EU press, for example. I think it's a great thing when people in the EU bubble are exposed to the ugly truths, sometimes it's ugly truths, that their populists think, right? We shouldn't be living in a bubble. And I'm also kind of a proponent of the free market of ideas, in a sense. Yeah, not to go into too many specifics, but there was a controversial thing said quite recently in Euractiv, right? I was very critical of it.
Yeah,
But
I think the debate is still ongoing, actually.
I was very publicly critical of that,
Yeah.
but I didn't want to give off the vibe at all that I don't think it shouldn't have been written. I'm happy for people to say what I think are really stupid things in the media, because I think those people should be openly ridiculed in public, and I'm happy for them to just be grilled in front of everyone. But I do also obviously understand the dangers that if you allow hate speech, pure hate speech, on too many platforms, there are people that can obviously spiral out of control. And there are good reasons why a lot of people feel very sensitive about allowing anything and everything, if we're talking of these populist narratives, to be across the media.
Do you have any stories of media coverage or campaigns that you worked on that positively impacted the lives of ordinary Europeans?
I honestly wouldn't pinpoint a single one, partly because I don't think journalists should, and by default, their media relations people should see such a tangible link between media coverage and an improvement in life. Because I think journalism, I studied journalism back in the UK. You kind of go through all these principles when you're learning about the industry. It's a public good, right? You're there to hold power to account. Some people see things slightly differently in different ways, but ultimately you're there to hold power to account. You're there to kind of provide access to information, convey things that you think the public should know about. And hopefully that improves people's lives. It certainly should improve the nature of a democracy, right? And the nature of a government. But I would hesitate to say that because of X coverage, why single mums now have access to something they didn't before, or because of this. You could draw a very easy link, for example, between the Qatargate scandal that recently happened, and that's now in the public domain, and people should know about that, this corruption. And in a sense, that's improved our lives because it's improved our understanding of what can go wrong. But I would hesitate to do that, and probably most journalists would as well. I exposed this story. There are some journalist activists who would probably claim this. They exposed certain stories, and now this evil company was destroyed. But I would like to think, at least, that a lot of the campaigns I've worked on have helped many different issues in some way. And you know how it is in Brussels. These issues range from kind of energy stuff to access to medicines, to health issues, all kinds of different things. So in theory, everything I do should be improving people's lives. Any media coverage I get for a client should be, at the end of the line, improving someone's life. But I would hesitate to say that.
Amazing, and I definitely agree. It's always very multi-layered, hard to pin it to one point. But the process itself, the more debate there is, the more voices are forced to share their concern, I think the better. Now, last question. If you would give advice to someone who probably listened to us outside of the Brussels bubble, hopefully we reach as many people as possible, and is trying to figure out where to start. Okay, this entire policy thing in Europe, maybe I'll try follow it. Maybe there is something relevant for me. Where to start? Where to even where to start fact checking what my politician is doing in because MEPs are going back to their voters, explaining what they did in Brussels, what's happening. Where to start fact checking? Where would you advise people to go for the right information that is not too
So this is
technically?
just seeking out information. They're not looking to work in Brussels. They're not looking for a job. Just seeking
Yeah,
information.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. One of the things when I worked at an agency and I had to kind of work on holistic communications campaigns that involved a big media component. One of the things I always tried to explain was something you somewhat alluded to at the beginning, which is that MEPs especially talk very differently in their home countries, and they even use different channels, right? For example, they're much more active on Instagram, talking in their own language than when they were on, and this is kind of back when it was in its pomp, on Twitter. Twitter, they'd be much more talking to the Brussels market, and there'd be two totally different messages, different vibes even that they were giving off. So I think really, if you're someone from, say, Poland, or I just picked Poland as a random country, and you wanted to understand what was going on with your MEP specifically, you would have to look at both of those channels that they use. So the channels they use for their home market, their domestic market, and the channels they use in Brussels, which now might be more LinkedIn, could still be X, might be LinkedIn. And then you'd probably have to just follow some news outlets who are based here. Like I said, you can't really get away from the EU media outlets, because from the national outlets, you're getting drips and drabs of the things that they think are most relevant for Poland, which may or may not be. Most of the biggest Polish newspapers will have a correspondent here, or they'll use news wires, so you can pay attention to them. But really, if you want a kind of holistic view of everything, you can't get away from the EU media. I wouldn't advise that someone starts going and snooping around the European Parliament websites, or even, I don't want to single out any publications, but there are certain publications that really go into like the niche legalistic side of legislation. It's not worth their time, and it will just turn them off completely. So yeah, you can't get away from EU media outlets, and then just looking at the social media feeds of their elected politicians.
So it's not a simple thing. We have to be honest
There's
here.
not a one-stop shop. No, there is not a one-stop. I mean, another thing you can do, which I sometimes find interesting, is you can follow on social media, but they write essays and blogs. You can follow people who, and I'm talking geopolitical analysts, who have a really solid understanding of Brussels. So that, and I find that those people are really useful in that they're able to zoom out a bit more and talk about that, because often they're working on other things now. Maybe they were in Brussels for a while. But they're based elsewhere, and they can talk about Brussels from outside of the bubble, essentially. So they bring that kind of greater perspective. Whereas if you're dealing with EU media, a lot of it is written by people who are kind of, I will use a phrase here that my colleague Brett will hate me for using if I do not credit the person who made it, which is David C. Baker. They're people who are inside the jar, can't read the label. That's how I would probably describe myself as that as well. Like, we're all in this jar, and sometimes we can't read the label because we're inside the jar. So it's really useful sometimes to find these geopolitical analysts, let's say, who can kind of give you that overarching narrative, which I find really useful to kind of just bring lots of different elements together.
I think that's the best way to go about it, and also to right away understand that understanding the Brussels bubble takes time. Even if you're following one MEP and one topic, it will take time because of how the process is constructed, and because saying that something is important. Like, for example, we have the Draghi report as the Bible of European competitiveness. what happened so far? Not much. The European Commission just introduced a couple of initiatives, to put it very, in simple terms, and it's all being debated. Nothing has changed. Nothing has been implemented. So until it reaches national regulatory level, it will take years, right? So this is how Brussels works, and if you want to understand it, you have to appreciate that there is a process that people engage, and maybe look for groups that represent your group of interest, and join them to also follow what someone is lobbying for in the process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky thing, and it's a kind of age-old question, because you're essentially asking how do you get people more interested in politics, and then not only that, it's how do you get people more interested in politics that's not even from their own country, politics that's EU-wide, that's regional politics. It's a very tricky thing. It sort of reminds me of the debate that we had in the UK about more and more people going to university. Maybe some people just they're not made to go to university. They don't want to go to university. It's better if they go off and get a trade. We don't need to send every single person to university, which we were kind of doing during the Blair years. And this is another one of those things. Like, not everybody will be bothered to do this, and that's okay. But we have to find ways, I guess, as democracies, as governments who care about this EU project, to get people on board, at least to the minimum level that they should be at. And in my opinion, that's probably education curriculums. That's probably unpopular for, I mean, I shouldn't be saying that. As a communicator, we just need one digital campaign, or we just need some kind of big bang type campaign, and that will solve everything. I don't think that's the case. I think it's trickier than that. And like you said, if people want to, those would be the hardcore nerds, right? Who, and that's fine. It's not a criticism. If they want to go and join communities and discuss this stuff and get into that. And I think we have seen, I saw in the EU Observer recently, to kind of give a shout out to them, that they have started trying to contextualize news at the top of articles. I don't know if it's every article, it's like series of articles, which is quite a smart way, I think, of just getting people up to speed. Because if you come in and you're seeing like Draghi report, competitiveness, all these words and people you don't know, and you have no idea of the context of that. Like, why is everyone talking about competitiveness now? Why is that such a sensitive subject? What was the Green Deal? How does that tie into this? Yeah, there needs to be techniques, probably new things to bring people up to speed. And it could be, maybe I'm old and crusty and getting it complete. It could be TikTok. It could be we just need more influencers on TikTok to talk about this. But I'm slightly skeptical. It could be AI as well. We have not dropped the AI bomb yet so far in this episode. Could help.
I'm sure that AI deserves another episode of the podcast, and I know that I already took more of your time than you promised to give to this conversation. So I'm very thankful, Habib, that you joined us today. Very interesting overview of the media role and scene in Brussels, and the potential to actually figure out how to reach more citizens and make the EU bubble more relevant. So thank you very much for all your insights. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Habib Msallem from Bump was our guest today.
Thanks very much. It was a pleasure to be here. And good luck with everything.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And thank you for everyone who was with us live. Of course, the podcast will be back with another episode next week.